Good evening, and welcome to the William G. McGarren Theater here at the National Archives. I'm David Ferreiro, the Archivist of the United States, and I'm pleased you could join us this evening for our look at Brothers at Arms, when the United States spoke French, the role of France in the American Revolution and its aftermath. Whether you're here in person watching us on YouTube or on C-SPAN, thanks for joining us. It's a special evening, appropriate evening for us to be doing this on April 20th, 2017, because 240 years ago today, Lafayette left France for the United States. We present this program in partnership with the French-American Cultural Foundation and the American Revolution Institute of the Study of Cincinnati, and we thank them for their support. After the panel discussion, please stop in the lobby where our two authors will be signing their books. And before we get started, I'd like to tell you about two programs coming up soon in this theater. Tomorrow at noon, we welcome David Nichols, the author of Ike and McCarthy, Dwight Eisenhower's Secret Campaign Against Joseph McCarthy. Using documents that had been previously unavailable or overlooked at the Eisenhower Library, Nichols chronicles President Eisenhower's involvement in the downfall of Senator McCarthy. On Tuesday, April 25th, also at noon, Elizabeth Cobbs will tell us about women sent to France during World War I to be switchboard operators. Her new book, The Hello Girls, America's First Women Soldiers, will also be for sale here. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online. There are copies in the lobby as well as a sign-up sheet where you can receive it by regular mail or email. You'll also find brochures about other National Archives programs and activities. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the Foundation, National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activity, and there are applications for membership in the lobby where you can become a member. And a little-known secret that I keep telling people about is no one has ever been turned down for membership in the National Archives Foundation. Americans advocating separation from Great Britain knew they had to have the backing of a major European power, and not just moral support, but material in the form of money, supplies, and men. England's ancient rivals, France and Spain, were the logical places to turn. From the earliest days of the war, Benjamin Franklin and other American envoys lobbied the courts of France and Spain. In the National Archives, we have the papers of the Continental Congress, which contain the long-running correspondence between Congress and its envoys abroad. The American diplomats' efforts were rewarded in the 1778 Treaty of Alliance and a Treaty of Amity and Commerce with France and the entry of Spain into the war in 1779. Arms and supplies from the Spanish governor of Louisiana aided the American cause, and at the end of the war, the French Army and Navy made the Yorktown victory possible. The stories of our nation's early days cannot be told without reference to the records here at the National Archives: diplomatic correspondence, treaties, military commissions, and more documents on the international side of the American Revolution. The two authors we have with us tonight will enlighten us about the roles France and Spain played in our country's formative years. So let's now hear from the panel. To lead the discussion tonight, we're happy to have Rosemary Zagari, a professor of history at George Mason University and the author of Revolutionary Backlash, Women in Politics in the Early American Republic. Larrie D. Ferreiro, the author of Brothers at Arms, American Independence and Men of France and Spain Who Saved It, teaches history and engineering at George Mason University. And François Furstenberg, the author of When the United States Spoke French, is professor of history at Johns Hopkins. But most importantly, François' parents. Are the Furstenbergs here? If you've ever shopped at Bread First on Connecticut, Furstenberg, first. There it is. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rosemary Zagari, Larrie Ferreiro, and François Furstenberg.
Well, good evening. I'm Rosemarie Zagari from George Mason University, and we're thrilled to see you all here tonight for this wonderful program. The first item of business is to let you know that it will not be in French, so maybe you're disappointed, but maybe you're relieved. In any case, what we'd like to do first is have each of our authors speak to you for a few minutes about their books and give you a general sense about what they talk about in their books. And we will be talking among ourselves and try and give you a good understanding of some of the issues that they discuss. And these are issues that you may not have thought about, because when we think about early America, the revolutionary and post-revolutionary periods, we tend to think primarily about England and the new United States. And this discussion will introduce you to whole other dimensions of the conflict involving France and Spain. So let's start with Professor Ferreiro, and he will talk about his book, Brothers at Arms.
Thank you. So in early 1776, Britain was engaged in a war with America, and America, of course, was fighting for independence, but without gunpowder, without guns, without artillery, without a navy. So it was only France and Spain, who were the historical enemies of Britain, that had both the military and the naval strength to defeat the British, which is why we needed their alliance. But they wouldn't ally with us if they saw it simply as a civil war. They had to be convinced that we were fighting as a sovereign nation, as a separate nation. And you can see John Adams' quote up there, which I have to turn and read, that foreign powers would not engage with us until we had acknowledged ourselves as an independent nation. And Adams was not known as a fan of foreign entanglements. Thomas Jefferson also said that a declaration of independence alone would allow European powers to treat with us. So this is important. The Declaration was not commissioned by Congress as a message to George III. He'd already gotten the memo. He knew that the Americans were fighting for independence, and the Americans knew this. They also weren't sending the Declaration for the American people, because the American people had sent their delegates to Philadelphia to vote for independence. In fact, the document that is upstairs in the rotunda was written specifically as a call to arms, an engraved invitation asking France and Spain to come fight alongside us. Now, when we started the war, we were bereft of gunpowder, guns, artillery, I mentioned that, and it was France and Spain who first began to furnish all of these arms. Even before the Declaration of Independence had been signed, a French merchant named Beaumarchais and Silas Deane, who was the American envoy in Paris, were negotiating for the sale of arms to come to the United States. And in late 1776, early 1777, a large shipment of arms under Beaumarchais carried 20,000 guns and other accoutrements that arrived just in time to supply the Americans who were about to face Burgoyne at Saratoga. And you can see this quote by Caleb Stark, who was there and who knew what happened, that unless these Beaumarchais arms had been timely furnished to the Americans, he said, Burgoyne would have made an easy march to Albany. So it was actually French arms which turned the tide of battle and, of course, gave the Americans their first taste of victory, major victory at Saratoga. Now, in the meantime, there were volunteers from France and from other parts of Europe who came to the United States. They came to fight the British because that was where the enemy was. But along the way, they came to make the American cause their own. And Washington came to depend upon these immigrants who got the job done, as the musical Hamilton so aptly portrays. So from my right, Louis Lebesgue Duportet became Washington's right-hand man. He was the engineer, he planned the fortifications, the sieges, and he understood strategy. And he was able to help Washington develop and deploy the strategic intent of the Continental Army. That Continental Army fought as a professional army under the not-so-gentle gaze and lash of Baron von Steuben, who created a training program that not only at Valley Forge, but then long afterwards, took a somewhat ragtag group of militia and formed an army that could actually go toe-to-toe against the British. And of course, Lafayette, the best known of the group, ended up with an independent command in the Southern Theater, and in that in those engagements, he kept Cornwallis from coming north, and he also followed Cornwallis all the way to Yorktown. Now, back in Europe, there were two individuals who were the most important characters in this whole story. To my right was the French Foreign Minister, the Comte de Vergennes. And of all the characters, he was the one who made most of the major decisions that concerned the alliances both between the France and the United States and between France and Spain. France and Spain were allied. They'd been allied through military and family ties. It was called the Bourbon Family Compact. Both kings were actually descended from Louis XIV. And even though they were allied, they had much different goals. The goal of France under Vergennes was to sufficiently weaken Britain so that it could regain the balance of power that it had lost during the 7 Years' War, which had ended just a decade earlier. In that alliance was also Spain. Spain had also come out rather badly during the war, the 7 Years' War, and they lost a lot of territory, including Florida. So Spain's primary goal was to regain territory. The French-American alliance of 1778 brought France into the war for the first time. And what that did was bring, most importantly, the French Navy into American waters. Any war at this time with Britain was always going to be a naval war. Remember, Britannia ruled the waves. So it prevented Britain suddenly from having the kind of dominance it was used to be able to resupply and move troops around. That knocked them back on their heels, but it would not have been enough until the Spanish foreign minister, the Conde de Floridablanca, on my left, who, as I mentioned, established the Spanish goals of recovering territory like Gibraltar and Florida, to come into the war. And the entry of Spain into the war a year later, 1779, fundamentally changed the nature of the war from a regional clash in North America to a global conflict. And the combined Spanish and French navies outnumbered the British, and they were overwhelmed. They had to defend not only their troops and territories in North America, but their colonies in the Caribbean. They had to defend lands such as Gibraltar and Minorca, even as far away as India. Meanwhile, back in Louisiana, Bernardo de Galvez, who was the governor of Spanish Louisiana, was supplying the American troops in the Western Theater with gunpowder and guns and supplies. But as soon as war was declared in 1779, he launched a series of raids that brought down the British posts at Mobile, Natchez, and at Baton Rouge. But the goal was always Pensacola, which was the capital of British West Florida and was the key to the Gulf of Mexico, which Spain wanted to recapture. And after a few setbacks by a series of devastating hurricanes, in 1781, he launched a joint Spanish-French attack that took Pensacola and got the British out of the Gulf of Mexico, which happened at just the right time because right about then, the the French commander, the Comte de Grasse, came to the Caribbean and asked the Spanish to please guard the French colonies in the Caribbean. Remember, that's where the money was, sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Please guard those colonies from the British while I take my entire fleet north to the Chesapeake. Now, the Comte de Grasse was a fighting admiral. He was loved by his sailors, who said of him, the Comte de Grasse stands 6'4" and 6'5" on days of battle. Washington and Rochambeau learned that de Grasse was heading to the Chesapeake, and so they raced south from New York to meet him and surround Cornwallis at Yorktown. Now, when they got there and Washington came aboard de Grasse's flagship, the Ville de Paris, de Grasse, who stood 2 inches taller than Washington, exclaimed, "Mon petit général." It's a real story. And oh, by the way, since you asked, yes, he was one of the ancestors of the rock star astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson. De Grasse was landing his fleet around the Chesapeake when the British fleet under Thomas Graves appeared. De Grasse sortied his entire fleet, defeated Graves, or rather drove him off, and once that happened, the British forces at Yorktown could neither be resupplied nor evacuated, and that sealed their fate. And the story of Yorktown is pretty well known. Washington and Rochambeau led the troops on a short, quick march, surrounded Yorktown, laid siege for 5 days, and that siege was directed by French officers who also directed the trenches, the gunfire, and the French also lost twice as many men as the Americans. So when Charles O'Hara, who was Cornwallis' second in command, came out to offer the surrender, he saw it as a French victory. And he offered the surrender to Rochambeau, but Rochambeau, of course, knew the moment belonged to Washington. So he directed O'Hara to Washington. Washington would not take a surrender from somebody else's second in command, so he directed him to Benjamin Lincoln, his own second in command, and the battle was over. Now, the battle was over, but the war was not, because I just said that the war was a world war. By the time Yorktown was fought, Britain was fighting 5 separate nation-states, and they were overwhelmed. The United States, France, Britain, they dragged the Dutch Republic into it, and the Kingdom of Mysore in India. All were fighting Britain at this time. So in summary, during this battle, this war, 200,000 French and Spanish soldiers and sailors fought, as compared with about 250,000 to 380,000 Americans. They were as invested in this war as we were. So I want you to know that America could never have won the war without France, and France would never have fought the war without Spain. And what I hope all of you take away is this, that America did not achieve independence by itself. Instead, it was born as the centerpiece of an international coalition which together worked to defeat a common adversary. And that's pretty much who we are today. We are the centerpiece of international coalitions striving towards a common goal. And that's why we remain today the indispensable nation. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll have Professor François Furstenberg talk about his book, When the United States Spoke French.
Thanks, Rosie. Okay.
Oh, that's supposed to...
Here we go. Well, let me begin by thanking Rosie Rosemary Zagari for moderating this panel discussion. It's really terrific. It's an honor to be here also with Larry, and thanks to David Ferreiro and Susan Clifton for hosting. It's really an ideal pairing, I think, these two books, because in many ways, I mean, if I'd written the book a little bit later, I would have understood it as a sequel, I think, to Larry's.
It's okay. I'm so glad you wrote yours first, because I leaned heavily on it.
I think it would have sold a lot more. as we've learned, the American Revolution really was a French victory. I think that's fair to say, something like that. Or at least I think it's fair to say that it was a French war as much as it was French and Spanish war as much as it was an American war. And maybe one of the things we can talk about actually is I mean, I've been thinking about this, in the wake of reading your book. We really need a new name for this war, don't we? So, in a sense, I mean, everything that I'll talk about sort of follows from what Larry was talking about, because just as the 7 Years' War led into the American Revolution, so did the American Revolution lead a decade later into another war, into the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, which lasted for nearly a quarter century. Now, there are lots of factors, of causes of the French Revolution. I think probably few things have been as studied as that one. But I think it's fair to say that the debt left over from French involvement in the American Revolution, because everything that you were talking about was enormously expensive. It's a lesson that people seem to keep forgetting, that wars are very expensive, and this left a crushing debt on the French government, and it was that debt that really was the catalyst for the French Revolution. And when the French Revolution broke out, Americans were thrilled. They could hardly have been more excited by the events. This was the most powerful monarchy in Europe that had suddenly, out of nowhere, fallen to its knees. It was like a dream, I think, for people. It seemed surreal. It's hard to capture the excitement, I think, and the shock. You have to think of May of 1968, maybe, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Arab Spring, President Donald Trump, all these astonishing, sort of unbelievable events, all of them wrapped up into this one spectacular moment. And best of all, Americans thought that they had really started this all. In 1792, France became a republic, and the excitement in the United States reached a frenzy. Everywhere there were parades, there were marches, songs, toasts. People were marching in the street. And then in January of 1793, King Louis XVI was executed, and aristocrats began to be massacred in the streets of Paris. And thousands of people fled, including many of them to the United States. And so the book that I wrote was about five of these refugees who came, of these emigres who came to the United States on their American adventure. And I thought sort of using their stories would be a way of looking at early American history from a different perspective, from slightly different eyes. Now, I had originally envisioned this is the story of many books, I'm sure, as a small little project, something that I could get over in a couple of years. But it quickly sort of ballooned into something much bigger. And it took me way beyond Paris.
Books.
Yeah, it took me way beyond Paris and Philadelphia, through London and into the Caribbean and deep into the American continental interior. And it grew beyond the five aristocrats who I started the book with, to include bankers in Amsterdam, slaves in Haiti, aristocrats in London, Native Americans in the Ohio Valley, and many other people. And all of them, it turned out, were involved with the story that I was trying to tell about these five figures. So I don't have a whole lot of time tonight to tell you all about the book. I'll introduce you briefly to the five characters who kind of structure the account, and then tell you three or four sort of important lessons that I kind of drew from the research that I did and the writing that I did, and then we can elaborate on that as we talk it through, and then we'll have some Q&A. So the first of the characters who I studied, and certainly the most famous today, is Talleyrand. Talleyrand, the former French archbishop who sat in the Constituent Assembly and who proposed the nationalization of church lands. He would go on to become France's longest-serving and most famous foreign minister, and he would largely reshape the map of Europe. And he spent a couple of years here along with all these others. There was also Louis-Marie, the Vicomte de Noailles, who was Lafayette's brother-in-law, and who actually fought, as one of the characters in Larry's book. He fought in the American Revolution. He was the person who actually negotiated French terms at the surrender, at Cornwallis's surrender. In the 1780s, after he returned back to France, he became a major figure in French reform circles, and it was he who presided over the Constituent Assembly on the historic night of August 4th, 1789, when feudalism was formally abolished. The third character was the Duc de la Rochefoucauld-Liancourt, who was one of the wealthiest aristocrats of old regime France. As the master of the king's wardrobe, it was Liancourt who famously burst into the king's bedchambers on the night of July 14, 1789, to tell him of the uprising in Paris. "Is it a revolt?" the king asked. "Non, sire, c'est une révolution," Liancourt famously replied. Then there was the Comte de Volnay, who was a traveler and a philosophe, a famous writer, and a future senator. And the last character was Moreau de Saint-Méry, who was a lawyer and a historian who'd been born in the Caribbean, who'd married into a wealthy planter family and gone to Paris to write about the Caribbean and to enter French politics. So these men were all aristocrats, but they were liberal aristocrats. They saw themselves following in the footsteps of the American Revolution. They admired the new United States and the Constitution that had been recently crafted, and they hoped to implement a constitutional monarchy in France that would look somewhat similar, substantially similar to the U.S. Constitution. And when the revolution began, when the French Revolution began, they became its leaders. And I think it's fair to say that had history taken a different path, they would today be considered the French Republic's founding fathers. We'd be singing songs about them maybe. But that wasn't the path that history took. They were forced to flee, and they came to the United States and settled in Philadelphia. So as I say, I don't have time to talk about the whole book. We've got some copies on sale outside. But I'll just make a few points here and talk about what I really took, what sort of surprised me as I did the research, or was really reinforced as I did the research and the writing on this point on this book. And the first really kind of builds on what Larrie was talking about. The kind of marginality, if you want to think about it that way, of the United States. These aren't your words, but I'll sort of rephrase that. I mean, the emigres came at a time when the United States was nothing like the power it is today. I think it really takes a kind of leap of imagination to understand the country as it was then. This weak, fragile collection of 13 states, really puny power, riven by divisions, continually under siege by native and foreign powers. Today, the United States is a continental and even global power, but back then, its sovereignty extended from the Atlantic coast as far as the Appalachian Mountains, with just a few fingers of sovereignty jutting into Kentucky and Tennessee. The heart of the Atlantic economy was in the South, in the Caribbean. That was Europe's main interest in the Americas, the islands, as Larrie was saying, that produced unbelievably rich stores of sugar, coffee, indigo, and all the commodities that were powering the Atlantic and the European economy. And in fact, it was to protect these islands, these French investments, that France had intervened in the American Revolution. That may have been the major reason it intervened in the American Revolution. American harbors and ports were expected to provide bases, naval bases, for French naval operations in the Caribbean. American resources like lumber and wheat would supply the sugar colonies just as they had been for so many decades, supplying the British sugar colonies. And so it was these kind of geostrategic interests that motivated French entry into the American Revolution, and these were the benefits that French authorities expected to reap after the American Revolution, using American harbors, American ships, American provisions to supply their colonies. Now, it didn't work out as they'd hoped for reasons that we can talk about. The French Revolution also quickly spilled over into the Caribbean. Shortly after revolution exploded in France, insurrection broke out in Saint-Domingue, which is today's Haiti. In 1791, slaves in the northern part of the colony began a rebellion that soon turned into a revolution against slavery itself. Under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, Haitian forces fought off French planters, invading Spanish forces and the British Navy. In fact, the Americans needed France and Spain to defeat the British. The Haitians, alone, without any support, defeated the French, the Spanish, and the British. The Haitian Revolution would upend the Atlantic economy and the labor regime on which it depended, and it would bring tens of thousands of refugees pouring into the United States. And so this was another lesson that really was driven home powerfully over the course of writing this book, was the importance of the Haitian Revolution for American history in this period. I think it's really impossible to tell the story of how the United States was transformed from this weak, fragile power into a continental power and eventually a global power without incorporating the history of the Caribbean. And the last thing that I learned that I'll talk about here is to think about Philadelphia in completely different ways than I had before. Now, Philadelphia was the capital of the United States, and it's where the refugees that I was looking at all settled. But it was a really very different city then from what it is today. It was a population of about 40,000 people, which is roughly the size of an large American university. Not even in the top 10, actually, of American universities. But the city itself, geographically, was tiny. Virtually all the population was huddled along the banks of the Delaware River. So it was an incredibly dense city, a density of 17,000 people per square kilometer, which is much denser than Philadelphia or even Manhattan of today. To see that kind of population density, you have to look to Bombay today. And thousands of French people poured into this mix, mostly coming up from the Caribbean. And I think it's hard to assess exact numbers. I mean, I never was able to figure out exactly how many, but somewhere between 3,000 and 8,000 French people came into Philadelphia in this period. So that's somewhere between 8 and 20% of the city, which was all of a sudden French-speaking. And so this is a really face-to-face city. 40,000 people living in an area much smaller than a medium-sized university campus. So the sudden arrival of all these thousands of French people was a significant event. And these waves of refugees pouring into the city really altered its social and its cultural life in this period. French wine and silk and mustard began arriving from distant ports. Merchants built grand, enormous houses in French neoclassical style and filled them with refined French furniture, ornate French tapestries, exquisite Gobelin porcelain. The aroma of French food wafted through the alleys behind South 2nd Street, including the delicacies prepared by Marino, who was a pastry chef who'd once worked at the French court at Versailles. French revolutionary songs were performed nightly in the Chestnut Street Theater and echoed off the cobblestones of the city's streets. Madame Mercier, who'd studied with Marie Antoinette's hairdresser, opened a shop catering to Philadelphia's transnational clientele. French silversmiths, French dentists, French dance instructors, all of them were applying their services. The French language rang out on Philadelphia's streets and in its most refined social circles. French newspapers, French bookstores, French taverns, all of these shaped the city's cosmopolitan public sphere. And so my 5 figures all settled in this one little Philadelphia neighborhood. They all lived together, they ate together, they socialized together, and they forged really intimate connections with each other. Every day that he was in Philadelphia, according to Moreau, Talleyrand would drop by in the evening. We opened our hearts to one another. We poured out our feelings. Each of us knew the other's most intimate thoughts. And Talleyrand ate nearly every day at a Franco-Dutch banker's house because, as he said, this Dutch banker employed a French chef. Talleyrand commented, the United States are the only country where if there are 32 religions, there's only one dish. And it's a bad one, he added. So over the course of the research, I realized that the 1780s and the 1790s was this kind of largely forgotten moment. I think when the United States was most turned, or this aspect, I think, of this period, which is largely forgotten, is that this was the period when the United States was most turned towards the world in general and towards France in particular. These merchants who structured the elite social life of Philadelphia had all gone rich off trade with France and the French Caribbean, and it was into these circles that my guys socialized. And following the emigres encounters took me through Philadelphia's elite salons and parlors, and it eventually brought me in contact with the continental interior, where they were investing heavily in backcountry lands, a story that I'd never occurred to me and never thought to sort of follow up on it. And eventually it brought me into contact with these important geopolitical issues bearing on the United States' relationship with the Caribbean, and ultimately on the Louisiana Purchase, or the Louisiana Sale, as you want to, depending on your perspective, I suppose, and which was all, as I say, tied up with events taking place in the Caribbean. So the period from 1793 to 1803 witnessed what I think is a really extraordinary transformation. Where the United States had once been hemmed in between the Atlantic coast and the Appalachian Mountains, its territory stretched all the way to the Atlantic, to the Rocky Mountains by 1803, and the country was on the way to becoming a great power. And much like Larry's story of the American Revolution, all of these transformations, I think, can't be understood without reference to events taking place in Europe and the Caribbean. And I think the point in many ways of both of these books is the extent to which American history, our history, is really so intimately tied up with these histories of other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.
Well, let me start with a question for both of you, because I'm sure the audience is curious about knowing how each of you turned toward or found your project, how your own background or interests led you to this slightly offbeat path.
Go ahead.
Well, for me, it was, my mother's French. I mean, my name is François, and I always had, I always had what I suppose economists would call a kind of comparative advantage in terms of being able to read a foreign language, something that very few American historians, I'm sorry to say, Larrie accepted, are able to do. But I wasn't, interested in doing French history or even kind of French-inflected histories of the United States. I mean, my first book was on George Washington's image. It's like really as American as you can get. I think, so what changed it actually, it was in a sense, I mean, it's less about kind of intellectual trajectories and more, in my case at least, about sort of personal trajectories. I got a job at the University of Montreal, which is a Francophone institution, so, in Quebec. And I was teaching American history, US history, to French students, to Francophone students. And I was in a department where there were only 2 of us out of, 20, 25 or 28 people who were working on US history. And in many ways, this was a really interesting place for me to be. And I don't think I would have done this book, actually, if I'd been teaching somewhere else in a US department in a bigger, where there were more American historians. But I wanted to try to make connections, I think, with my colleagues and with my students. So I was trying to figure out something that would connect the period of American history that I was interested in with France or with the Atlantic world. And I guess it was also, I should say, a time when many historians, many prominent historians, were kind of expanding their focus. I mean, there was a move at the time to kind of internationalize or Atlanticize American history. So the path had been opened for me by a lot of scholarship, but it meant that I was able to work in this field, to make what might have been a sort of marginal account it was something that was going to draw the attention of other historians, I think, because it fit into the kind of problems that we were talking about at the time. So it's really a combination of kind of the intellectual historical context, and then the fact that I just, I wanted to do something, sort of French-inflected Francophone in a sense.
Larry?
Well, I came at from a much different direction. I'm a naval architect by profession. I designed ships for many years. My wife is from Peru, which is, although I have a Spanish last name, why I learned Spanish. And as part of my job, I went to France to work in their Navy for several years in their ship design division and did a lot of research on the side. And then, by the way, I would tell all of my French colleagues, because of course I had to learn French to work there, is that I learned French for business, but I learned Spanish for love. My wife still likes that. So while I was there, and our firstborn son, Marcel, was born there, French name, I began studying the roots of my profession and decided to get my doctorate in history of technology and look at the rise of shipbuilding in the age of sail. That's really what I was interested in. And there I discovered that France and Spain had worked together right after the 7 Years' War had ended, almost before the ink was dry on the Treaty of Paris, to rebuild their navy and create a combined navy that was going to defeat Britain. And they did that by sharing shipbuilders and engineers and artillerists. And so, and this all became part of my doctoral work. So I knew going into, as my children were growing up, that they had combined their forces, and it was that combined navy that really was the key to the defeat of Britain. But when my children were in school and I saw that France was barely mentioned in the story of the revolution and the Spanish not at all, I began to wonder why there was a gap between what I knew and what I saw. And when I kind of lobbed the idea to my agent, she said, I think there's a story there. And I said, I think so. So I spent the next year schlepping my kids up and down battlefields and encampments and learn, in addition to the work that I'd already been doing in the archives, found a much wider story than America had started in 1776, and you all know the battles. It was a world war. And again, just to be very clear, any kind of war that anybody was fighting Britain at the time was always going to be a naval war. So I got into this story in a large part because of my naval background, but also because when you're doing anything involving engineering, you're always, looking at what the larger context is. So why were they building, why were they building up this fleet, which is a huge investment in manpower, in supplies, and there was a political intent to defeat Britain, and America was always going, for France and Spain, America was always going to be part of that equation. They always knew that America was going to be going up against Britain at some point, and they certainly were prepared to exploit the American Revolution that they knew was going to happen long before we did as part of that goal. So what I saw was a fleet that was built to create what amounted to a large coalition that would eventually defeat a common enemy, each one for their own reasons. And that's no bad thing. You don't go to war because you are being altruistic. What I saw were three nations that each had individual goals, but those goals had a common purpose, and that's why they allied. And that's pretty much what we do today, just to be very clear. When we ally with other nations, we do so for our own interest. So I saw a lot of parallels between then and today. And that's really what got me into this.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's so interesting about this kind of approach to the late 18th century is that it wrenches us out of our traditional United States-centered narrative, and we see how interconnected America was with the rest of the world. And I think it's easy for a lot of non-historians to think, oh, globalization, that's a 20th or 21st century invention, or we didn't have world wars until the 20th century. And so what your work, both of your work does is really help us see that these kinds of connections of people, of alliances, of geopolitics existed, for centuries, if not millennia. But one thing that I noticed, neither one of you addressed, your remarks obviously had to be brief, but there was a lot of suspicion toward France and toward French people in America, because after all, before the American Revolution, the people in North America were largely Anglo-American. They considered themselves British, and France was the traditional enemy of Britain. And there was also a very strong anti-Catholic element. And so for each of your periods, I'd like you to talk a little bit about attitudes toward France or the French that Americans encountered, suspicion, hostilities, or welcome with open arms, and how you think it changed American attitudes toward France.
Should we do it chronologically?
Sure.
So you make exactly the points that I found, that the sentiment against the French, which was in part because they'd been the enemy during what we call the French and Indian Wars, it was called the 7 Years' War, was only a decade old. The memories were very strong. And the religion and all the other aspects meant that when the first French troops and volunteers were coming, they were not well regarded. Nathanael Greene actually said, "These are so many spies in our camp." That's how we referred to them. But when the first battles, especially, and I point this out at Brandywine, erupted, things changed. The Congress, Washington, the other officers really didn't know what to do with these people. They were coming in, some of them quite brusque in terms of where they wanted to be placed. They were experienced soldiers, but there was no political way to insert them into the American military system, which was as much political, because generals were chosen based on state more than they were based on there weren't that many battles that they'd fought prior to this, so it was kind of hard to see who did better in battle. And that really made things quite difficult for the Congress. But when the Battle of Brandywine and then a few subsequent battles were fought, and they just had to throw them into the mix, these French volunteers did quite well. In fact, I point out that one of them, you may not know his name, it's Théodore de Fleury, was an engineer, and today's Army Corps of Engineers now has a medal, the Fleury Medal, for courage and boldness. And it was that slow first acceptance that these French volunteers were equal to the Americans in terms of how they could fight. And then eventually they showed that they were able to contribute and contribute a lot. And they became, I just said, the immigrants who got the job done. Washington relied on them. Congress accepted them. So by the end of the war, there was a real it was really coalition warfare in the sense that we kind of think of today. I give a lot of, I spend a lot of room in my book talking about the relationship later in the war between Rochambeau and Washington, because those two really did see each other as equals. And even though Rochambeau, who'd come over after the alliance, was always serving under Washington, their relationship was one of equals. And the soldiers respected each other. Even after the war, Washington came to rely on Rochambeau's advice. And at the end, there's a wonderful little line where he says, "We have lived together as brothers," which is one of the reasons why my book is so titled. So this is something that if you've ever been in uniform, no matter who you're serving with, the bonds between people who are fighting in a common cause far outweigh any differences that the nationalities might have caused for division. So in my period that I covered, it was more that band of brothers idea that brought the two together. Then, of course, things changed.
Yeah, I mean, there's this. It's a really funny, sort of paradoxical relationship, right? This kind of French-American relationship, or for a long time it was a British-French relationship. I mean, they've been at war, like just 10 years earlier, like you were saying, they've been at war really for a century. I mean, the New England colonists had been fighting French settlers, and anti-Catholicism was such a big part of British kind of political culture and self-identity. And then the revolution comes along, and all of a sudden everybody's pro-French, and they're celebrating the French, and they're celebrating the birth of the Dauphin, and they've got pictures of Louis XVI. This revolutionary power has pictures of the monarch. But underneath this apparent transformation, I think there are continuities as well. There's a kind of undercurrent of anti-French and anti-Catholic sentiment that continues. Maybe, I don't know, it goes underground or something like that, and it's not too hard to sort of unleash it, to activate these currents. And I think it explains, in large part, the equally sudden transformation. I mean, the same kind of transformation in reverse. I mean, that happens in the 1790s. So when the French Revolution breaks out in 1789, everybody's pro-French. Now the last real problem with France as an ally, the fact that it's the most powerful absolutist monarchy in the world, is gone. So now these are two sister republics. So the Franco-American alliance seems stronger than ever. But within 5 years, by the mid 1790s, they're mid to late 1790s, they're in a quasi-war with each other. There's a huge falling out, and I think that has to do with the kind of continuity of these anti-French sentiments. The other thing, I mean, so it could be partly based on culture, I think, partly based on religion, but there was a French. There's this tendency to view this kind of falling out in the quasi-war and the Alien and Sedition Acts, the very strong nativist sentiments and laws that emerged in the late 1790s, which people still refer to today, as a kind of outbreak of anti-immigrant and anti-French, in particular, paranoia. But I will say that there were some reasons to be worried about the French presence and French ambitions in North America by the late 1790s, and part of that has to do with the ways that French settlement had developed in the previous centuries. So the French had been were never a settler colony, a settler-dominated colony, except with a small exception of the St. Lawrence Valley. But most of New France had been a system of alliances between Native Americans and French settlers and French traders. and French military officers. And even long after France left the continent, these Native Americans continued to dominate Western regions militarily, and many of these old French alliances existed. So there was a scene in one of the books. Liancourt wrote this 8-volume memoirs of his travels, and there's a scene in there one time where he's talking about being out west. He's in the West, and he hears someone speaking French, and so he tries to find out what it is, and it's a Native American. And then there's this conversation, and he says, the Indian says to him, the Americans, they're our brothers, but the French, they were our fathers. And there's a kind of there's a sense that there's this strong bond, and French authorities are actually counting on this when they're looking to the West in the 1790s. They're counting on these old alliances to be remobilized. And Americans are quite worried about this. So, it's not just a cultural thing. There are also kind of strategic reasons that there's this kind of turn towards an anti-French sentiment. But that's, this kind of love, hate, fear relationship is very continuous. I mean, when I started the research on this book, it was the era of freedom fries and pouring out French wine in the gutter. So that, there are some things that continue.
One thing, though, during this period, if I can jump in, the link between the militaries remained reasonably strong. It was during this period when the new nation had decided that it needed to have a professional army even in peacetime, and so it was under Thomas Jefferson a little bit later that the idea of a military academy, which had first been proposed by one of the characters I pointed out earlier, Duportet, was created at West Point. And the first supervisors of West Point were the first leaders of the Army Corps of Engineers were French, and they continue to maintain that connection. Many of the textbooks, much of the training, much of the instruction continue to come over from there. And on the armament side, we began to create a system of manufacture. I mentioned that we had no real capability of making arms. Well, that changed when many of the French engineers stayed, and they began to create factories. Many more came during the period that you were referring to. Most of you know about DuPont, and he was one of the family of DuPont was one of the gunpowder manufacturers. And as they were able to impart their knowledge, the Americans did what Americans do best. We take what other people have and we change it and we create our own system out of it. And so the American system of manufacture, which became what we would call today mass production, really began with many of the French engineers and processes that had come over, and starting in the military, but then elsewhere. So there were always, despite the sentiments of perhaps larger parts of the population, there were always strands of connection that remained strong throughout this era.
Well, and there was, of course, the founding of the Society of the Cincinnati, which was an organization of American and French military officers who had served in the American Revolution. And, I mean, this was a very visible and controversial sign of this continuing relationship. And the organization still exists. The
Yes.
building is, right here in Washington, and it's still a hereditary organization where the membership goes to the firstborn son in France or in the United States. So, yeah, that was one of the continuing bonds as well. But, one of the other things you mentioned, Larry, is that France and Spain entered the war for their particular purposes, not because they were enamored of Republican government, not because they were actually that sympathetic to the idea of the United States becoming an independent nation, but because they had their own strategic goals with relation to Britain, right?
Yes.
And I think, that continues, that sort of geopolitics continues into your period. And do you want to talk about, François, the story of how the United States got the Louisiana Purchase? Because I don't think it's widely known outside of historian circles, and I think it's one that is fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, so after, as I said, when the French intervened in the American Revolution, they had ideas that this would help them. I mean, there was always this expectation that France would be in war with Britain before long, and there was this sense that in the next war, having the United States as an ally to France would be very useful for our operations in the Caribbean. They had been thrashed, as you say, in the 7 Years' War in terms of their naval operations, and they had lost many of these very lucrative sugar islands, which they managed to get back in the peace. But there's a sense that these North American colonies in British possession make our Caribbean colonies very precarious. Our hold is very tenuous. So the French think that by detaching the North American colonies, not only would they weaken the British Empire, but they would strengthen their own hold on the Caribbean. Now, because of the kind of diplomatic and military falling out that happened in the 1790s, it wasn't working out this way. The Americans in George Washington, with the outbreak of the French Revolution, declared neutrality. I mean, with the outbreak, I should say, of war between France and Britain, declared neutrality. And this was really a betrayal of the treaty of amity and commerce, which the French signed with the Americans in the American Revolution. I mean, the French were expecting the United States to stand by their side. I mean, I don't think anybody expected them to send some battalions over to Europe to march against Britain, but to provision French ships, to help man and repair French ships, to use these harbors, these beautiful harbors along the coast, against British warfare, which the United States systematically refused to do. Now, many historians will say this was a very wise decision by George Washington, but it was not what the French had gone into the Revolution expecting. So they began to decide by the late 1790s that it would be important to have colonies of their own, French colonies of their own, in order to maintain their hold on the Caribbean. And this was the main reason that Napoleon became interested in reacquiring Louisiana, because Louisiana, which wasn't just the state of Louisiana, but which was in the entire Mississippi Valley, everything really up from the Mississippi River all the way to the Rocky Mountains, would serve all these purposes that they were expecting from the United States. That is to say, it would provide bases for naval support. It would provide supplies for the French colonies, for the Caribbean colonies. So it would, in a sense, replace the United States, now that the United States had proved itself this very fickle ally. So that was why Napoleon wanted so he sent a huge army over to take Louisiana. The problem was that the Caribbean, from his perspective, was that the Caribbean colonies were in outright revolution. Slavery was undermined dramatically by the Haitian Revolution, and so in order to re-energize the sugar economy, he sought to put the freed slaves back into slavery. So he sent this army of tens of thousands of French troops. First to Saint-Domingue, and the expectation was they would put down the Haitian Revolution, they would put the slaves, the former slaves, the freed slaves, back into slavery, and from there they would sail on to New Orleans and hold Louisiana. And it's very hard to imagine how the Americans would have dislodged this massive French army from New Orleans. But it didn't work out that way. It was the success of the freed slaves, of the former slaves, in defeating the French forces. I mean, tens of thousands. It was more French soldiers died in Saint-Domingue in Haiti than died in Waterloo. It was a brutal war, and the French army was defeated. And once it was defeated, there was no way that they could go to New Orleans and hold Louisiana. And in fact, there wasn't much purpose actually in having Louisiana anyway. The purpose had been for the Caribbean, and they had lost the most important Caribbean colony. So it was the success of the Haitian Revolution that led to the Louisiana Purchase. It was at that point that Napoleon decided to sell this now largely worthless piece of land to the Americans, from his perspective, and so he sold it to the Americans because, and this is one of the great kind of historical paradoxes and ironies. It was the success of Haitian slaves in freeing themselves and fighting off the French and maintaining their freedom that led to the massive expansion of American slavery into the Cotton Belt, into the Deep South, across Alabama and Mississippi and into the Mississippi Valley, and in a sense kind of set the stage, if you want to think about it that way, for the Civil War a few generations later.
Yeah, great. Well, so we can keep chattering among ourselves, but we'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. You can go to the microphones, either there or there. Don't be shy.
Hi, Thank you very much. This is very fascinating so far. Really appreciate it. I had a question about the willingness of the United States to. You said that certainly we were interested in having France and Spain as allies. We needed the gunpowder. We needed their assistance. So we were thinking about it in terms of cost and benefit to the United States. And so I was wondering, to what extent was the United States willing to make additional concessions to these foreign powers? Like one of you had mentioned previously that Spain was trying to recapture some territory in Florida, and certainly the French had additional interest in the United States as well. So was there any sort of discussion among the the nascent American in like politics in the United States on like what we were willing to concede to these foreign powers? Thank you.
The alliance was always between the United States and France. Spain did not formally ally with the Americans, so there really were no treaty negotiations to speak of, and certainly no concessions. Concessions came afterwards when they were debating about where the line of control on the Mississippi was. But during the war, the Treaty of Alliance and also the military treaty in 1778, primarily there was the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, which I think said we will be nice to each other and we'll trade. Actually, it was based on John Adams' model treaty that was very specifically economic in nature. And that's what Franklin had kind of gone over with originally. And the military treaty said very little that I can remember in 1778 about any concessions, about land. There was nothing in there about we're going to pay for this or pay for that. This was not a transaction. This was a treaty. There's a difference. Treaties are, I've got your back, you've got my back. So in this case, it was America agreed that it would not end the fighting unilaterally, nor would it make a separate peace with Britain. And as far as France was concerned, it would not stop fighting until Britain agreed to the sovereignty of the United States. So those were the terms of the treaty. And when Spain wrote the codicil in 1779 to its alliance with France, that was called the Treaty of Aranjuez. It also stipulated that Spain would not stop fighting until Britain agreed to the sovereignty of the United States. So there, again, no direct alliance, but Spain and France together said Britain is either we're going to be defeated or Britain is going to recognize America as an independent nation. So did that answer your question?
Could you at this point mention that the biggest battle of the American Revolution did not occur on American soil because this place is now in the news again?
So I was kind of surprised to see that the Siege of Gibraltar, which started the day after the Treaty of Aranjuez was signed and didn't end until until the treaties were signed, probably pulled in more soldiers and sailors from both sides. The numbers I saw were something like 60,000 Spanish troops were arrayed around. Let me just quickly set the stage. Maybe not all of you knew that Gibraltar had been British territory, even though it was physically attached to Spain, since 1704. I may have the date a little bit wrong. And it had always been a thorn in Spain's side. For Britain, this was a strategic point because it, of course, guards the entrance to the Atlantic and to the Mediterranean. Remember, Britain is a naval power. Britain's army was okay, but Britain's navy was second to none, which is why, and so Gibraltar was always that naval stronghold, which is why they fought so hard to keep it. And that battle raged, the siege raged for 4 years. And there was a battle that took place in 1782, I think September, that was so fierce. There were something like one shell fired every 3 seconds. And by the end of it, there were explosions with mushroom clouds, the same as you would see over Japanese cities 200 and something years later, mushroom clouds rising over the harbor. This was just a fiercely fought battle, and Britain never gave in. And they came away at the end still in possession. So this is why I've said one of the things, and you said this, Rosemary, very well, we've had an American-centric view of the war, but many of the battles took place well outside the view or even the knowledge of the Americans. Britain really wasn't beaten as much as they were just overwhelmed.
Yes?
Comments very much. As I understand it, these 5 were refugees after the French Revolution took a more decided leftward turn. So what was their position in 1793 when the Jeffersonians and their allies were urging that the U.S. give aid to France during the war on the continent? Did they just lie low? Were they part of the game? What did they do when Citizen Genet came over?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The short answer is that they were lying low in this period. I mean, they had represented this kind of political center in France, a kind of centrist, a kind of political liberalism, really, which collapsed as the French Revolution became more radical, as the Jacobins and the Girondins took power, and so they were forced to flee, and they. As far as I can tell, they never gave up their sense of Frenchness, if you want to think about it that way. They never came to the United States thinking that they were going to stay. The only possible exception is Noailles, whose wife and father were executed in '93. But for the most part, they always understood themselves as in temporary exile. And in the early years that they were here, in '94, '95, they don't seem to have had any kind of political ambitions, so far as I can understand it. Noailles was hanging out with Hamilton and actually giving him some suggestions on military operations or troop movements or things like that for training, not for war purposes. And they would go to Washington, had these levees. George Washington was president at the time. He had these levees, and they would go and socialize. Some of them had known Washington earlier, or had correspondence with him. Noailles had fought with Washington. And Washington decided, actually, so to answer your question about Genet, this was when Genet came over as ambassador, and he didn't want these guys having anything to do with Washington. He feared the French ministry, Fouché, the person who preceded, and then Genet, feared that these guys were trying to sway the Americans towards in an alliance with Britain. That wasn't that was unfounded, that fear, but that was what they worried about. And eventually Washington acceded to these demands. He said, they can't come to my levees anymore, to my public receptions. So they stopped coming. They're socializing. They socialized mostly in Federalist circles. Volney was good friends with Jefferson, and he visited, and he spent a few days or maybe a few weeks at Monticello, and they had a long correspondence, which Jefferson later repudiated. But otherwise, they were mostly sort of in Federalist political circles, and I think that's their kind of closest political alliances or sympathies would have been with the Federalists, but they never got involved in Federalist politics. Now that changed by 1796 as the falling out began between France and the United States. They seem to have become more. Now I never there was no smoking gun or anything like that I found out. Talleyrand had already left, but Liancourt, I think, was passing information, not sensitive military or political, but just kind of political information, I think, to the then French ambassador, who Genet had been expelled long ago, and so they were understood to be in alliance with France at that point, and there were some fears, and I think not unfounded fears. Volney was traveling in the West, and it wasn't clear what he was doing. He was in the Ohio Valley. There were other people at the same time, French officers who were actually spies, who were traveling along the Ohio Valley, along similar routes, looking at American forts, sort of military encampments, and who were clearly drawing up designs for taking back this area. Now, I don't think Liancourt was doing that, and I don't think Volney was doing that, but they were associated with these people. So eventually, the ones who were still here in 1798, when the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed, were actually targeted for expulsion. So Volney had to leave the country. Moreau left the country because they were actually kicked out, or they were about to be kicked out. So their politics, in a sense, their politics may have stayed the same, but everything was swirling around them. French politics was changing so dramatically. Diplomatic relationships were changing. So I sort of see them as having not changed very much in their own views, but everything else changed around them. The whole world turned around them in a sense, and so the situation looked quite different at the end.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah?
Okay, because I've always had trouble explaining the quasi-war with France, even after having read many things. Can you draw us kind of a straight line of what the events were that led to and why, and then what caused it to dissipate?
Well, the Franco-American alliance by this time had been really, it was in tatters by this point. So now I'm talking 1797. There are really powerful anti-French sentiments that are reemerging. There's American ships being sort of captured by French shipping in the Caribbean, and so there's a sense, and the Federalists, who've always been anti-French Revolution since the, maybe not the very outbreak, but since 1791 anyway, they're mobilizing for war. They view anti-French political sentiment as their means to get back into power, or to hold on to power anyway. So John Adams sends a diplomatic contingent to Paris to try to negotiate some kind of peace. Adams did not want war with France. There were arch-federalists, including Hamilton, who were mobilizing for war against France, and they were right. I mean, this was their path to power. It's not the first or the last time that people would view war as their path to political power, or to hanging on to political power. And Adams, to I think this is my editorial comment, to his great credit, actually, did not want a war. He didn't think that the United States was ready to handle a war with France, and he was probably right about that. So he sent this mission to the great despair of his political allies to France to try to negotiate a peace, which was with Talleyrand, who by this time was the foreign minister. Talleyrand handled this very badly. He demanded bribes rather than negotiate peace, and I think he really misread. Yeah, he was ungrateful. I mean, he misread the political situation in part from his experiences in the United States, actually. So he radically misread this. So he demanded bribes, and two of the American negotiators left in a huff. One tried to keep things together, and this is when there were these demands for war. I mean, so despite John Adams, he had to accede, and Hamilton became general. Washington was named general. I mean, it's this kind of weird moment, and it was a quasi-war. It's the first, I think, this is a kind of interesting moment, actually, in military history. I don't know, but I think it may be the first time there is a sort of undeclared war, this kind of low-grade war. And it basically it's about military battles, on sea. But it's an undeclared war, and there are some interesting parallels between that kind of Cold War later. I mean, the ways in which war is conducted. But ultimately, this Adams basically restrains things, and Talleyrand comes to his senses and negotiates a peace with the United States. So the cover never completely blows off, but these, it's basically naval operations in the Caribbean with ships being captured. I mean, the last thing I'll say, and I'll stop, but the line between formal war and not is unclear, because a lot of operations have to do, and you know this much better than I do, have to do with privateering. So these are kind of private commercial shipping, which are given letters which allow them to fight, as a kind of de facto navy. And so that's what's going on. It's privateering in the Caribbean, which is going on.
Thank you.
One little footnote. This is when the Dr. George Logan of the Logan Act is a private citizen from Philadelphia, goes over and unilaterally, on his own authority, tries to negotiate a settlement with France. And after that, the Congress passes this law that is being invoked today, strangely enough. See,
yeah, he was a
history's
Republican.
relevant.
He was a Republican, and he didn't want this war. And he went, exactly, to try to unilaterally on his own accord to try to negotiate peace, and it was not viewed well by the Federalists for obvious reasons.
We have a very patient questioner over here.
Thank you very much. I was wondering whether there's other narratives, a French perspective on this, and also a perspective of the Native Americans. So let me just start it off. I mean, this war that George Washington had participated in 1752, which was a disaster.
Actually started the war.
He started the war. So it was basically going into the Ohio Valley and trying to take that land. And as a result of that, the French and the Indians defeated that operation. And some treaties came out of it that basically restricted the expansion of the United States to the Appalachian Mountains. So those were the treaties that were in effect that allowed the French and the Indians to get along quite well, or in their relationships, and kept the Americans from expanding. After the American Revolution, all bets were off. This was the expansion into the Indian territories, the Ohio Valley. It was quite destructive to native populations, and also I guess it was a little upsetting as well to the French, who thought they would have some kind of a... And then the buildup of what you called this underclad war, as the Federalists, especially up in New England, looked towards Canada as the first part of Manifest Destiny, which eventually results in the burning of York, the capital of Canada, and a kind of America on its own, which led to the burning of Washington in 1814. So I'm thinking that there must be also a different perspective from the Canadian point of view, from the French point of view, and from the Native American point of view,
Yeah.
and how we can kind of understand our current history, which is also continually spreading its values with well, I guess with some military force, how, we can, because we build on these ideas that it's all good to be a part of this expansion with weapons. And I mean, I'm just thinking that maybe there's another way of approaching it. We've reached, in fact, maybe the end of empire.
So the perspectives you're referring to, Native Americans and the effect on them, also the enslaved people, the people of Canada, are part of as Rosemary had said, the wave of historical studies that have recast the revolution and its aftermath in new lights. Now, I can recommend the book I can think of for Canada is in French, and the name will come to me eventually. But for the other aspects you're referring to, the Indian and others, I can heartily recommend, now first buy my book, then buy François' book. Sorry, he'll tell you, he'll say, no, first buy my book, then buy Alan Taylor's American Revolutions. And you might want to also get, I think you can get a good 2-for-1 discount with his American colonies. And he treats very well exactly the aspects you're talking about. American Revolutions goes from about 1750, actually precedes the 7 Years' War all the way through to about 1820 or so, and it talks about that sweep of history of which the American War of Independence is one part, and it's a civil war that continues, and the drive into the Ohio Valley afterwards, displacing the native nations, all becomes part of that fabric, and it is quite well done. So I can't really answer the question because somebody else already has, is what I'm suggesting.
I mean, I think, from the kind of Native American perspective, the revolution, I mean, long term was a catastrophe. I mean, the success of the American Revolution, that is to say. I think it's, had the Americans not won that war, I mean, who knows? We're in the realm of fiction here. But they, I think they would have been in a stronger position. The Iroquois mostly allied with Britain, with the British Empire. I mean, they had long-standing alliances, but there were also obvious reasons for them to be supporting the British. Only the Oneida allied with the Americans, and that was a bad bet for them. The Iroquois lost. I mean, the British lost, so they were not in a good position after the war. Now, I mean, I've come around to thinking that from a kind of general Native American perspective, if you can posit such a thing, this whole period from the outbreak of the 7 Years' War until the War of 1812, which you were referring to in your question, was one long war to maintain their territory, to keep the British and then the Americans out of their territory, and ultimately a losing battle. But there were a losing war. But there were several sort of pivot points. There were several moments where things could have turned out quite differently. Where it's not hard to imagine things turning out differently. And one of them actually is one you were referring to. When the French and the Americans signed this alliance, the Americans committed themselves to not negotiating a separate peace with Britain. And they broke that. They were not the reliable allies. They broke that
Yes,
commitment. And it's largely because they thought, and they were probably right about that the French were going to try to keep this the Ohio Valley as neutral territory, neither British nor American. And so the Americans didn't want that, and so they got this concession from Britain by negotiating a separate peace. From the Canadian perspective, I don't. It's a complicated question because, first of all, there is no Canada until much later. So this is really British North America. Things get reappropriated. So not too long ago in the War of 200th anniversary of the War of 1812, there were attempts to call it Canada's War. I mean, the government at the time was kind of mobilizing this, which always made me laugh because there was no Canada. Nobody was fighting on behalf of Canada. But in retrospect, it becomes Canada's War. But I mean, that is a moment, another of these kind of pivot points when things could have turned out quite differently. I mean, the Americans invaded Canada, as you say, invaded British North America, Upper Canada, and they could have they could have taken it. They thought they were going to. And in retrospect, they were pushed out by the British Empire. In retrospect, it becomes a moment where Canadian sovereignty is established, where what's now considered Canadian sovereignty. And that really wouldn't be contested after that. I mean, there were rebellions in the 1830s, but the Americans by that point, had no interest in allying themselves with patriot rebellions, as they call them, in Canada. So that in retrospect emerges as the final kind of the last attempt. During the American Revolution, there were attempts by the Americans to invade Canada. They thought the French settlers would rise up in alliance with them. It wasn't the case. But these two things are very much tied together. I mean, this attempt, the American attempt, they were continually wanting to push west, and it was first they were pushing up against the French, and then they were pushing up against the British government, as you said, in the 1760s, and they never wanted these restrictions. Then they were pushing up continually against the Native Americans, and it was this kind of relentless push west that drove a lot of this early history in this period.
Yeah. And by the way, I don't want to leave Spain out. Although I'm not going to go into any detail, the same forces were happening in Spanish Florida, as well as further to the west in what was then the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which was today Mexico, all the way up through much of the southwest. And there were the same tensions there, and quite often very rocky relationships. So when you think about North America, it really is a confluence of three large colonial powers, all trying to push in the same directions. And the Native American nations, who were not in any way a monolithic set of nations, but many nations arrayed around the lands, were continually being forced into regions that they did not traditionally inhabit, nor did they want to be in. So, the whole history is starting to look less, as you're starting to see historians rethink this, less this relentless push west as much as it's pushing from the north, it's pushing from the east to the west, and also pushing from the south. What is always amazing to me, though, is at this point, we're talking end of the 18th century, there's three big actors playing the roles pretty much around the whole of North America. Fast forward just about 30 years, and suddenly there's a dozen or more independent nations suddenly in this territory that used to just be the battleground of three great powers. Now it's a half dozen or a dozen nations trying to figure out where they're going to go from there. That was really the impact of this Revolution and post-Revolution period.
Great, thank you. So, closing remarks? Closing questions to the audience?
Oh yeah, by the way, we didn't let you know that there's going to be a quiz when you...
In French, in French. No, so we'd like to remind you that both books will be for sale. Both authors will be available for book signing. There is a 15% discount, and we'd invite you to read more deeply into this fascinating new approach to the era of the American Revolution. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Larry.
Good job.
and François.